Hello, and welcome back. Sorry it's been a while. I've just basically been ill, and work's been really busy, so I haven't really had time to make another video, but I'm back now. Um, Thought I'd start off by sort of running over what's happened since I made the last video. So Reform were in a bit of a dip, and they've recently started coming back. I mean, to be fair, most of the downward trend they had experienced seemed to be with UW. A lot of the other pollsters actually still had them on, like sort of 30, 31, 32% ish, which is still pretty good. So, yeah, it was YouGov that had them down. I think down as low as 26% at one point, and the Tory was high as 19. But yeah, that everyone, of course, all the, the sort of sycophant Tories on Twitter and X were, proclaiming that the reform was on the downward, and the Tories were coming back. And as we've seen from the last two polls, that's not really materialising. Reform's trending back up towards 30%, and the Tories are trending back downwards. So not really surprising, but it sort of bucks the narrative that Reform had sort of peaked and plateaued and were heading downwards, or that they've been so-called found out. Don't think that's happened. But anyway, yeah, the latest YouGov poll has them on 28%, which is, yeah, as I said, turning back upwards. Greens up too. The fact that they're competing for third place with the Tories is quite embarrassing, but there we are. So, God, what have we had happened in the last couple of weeks? I mean, God, we've had prisoners that out accidentally. Let's kind of have a look at the last few days. I mean, yeah, Reform made a few announcements. They had what they do with the civil service, and they had announced some stuff to do with like special education needs reform, which is a quite a growing issue, to be honest. I mean, the amount of kids nowadays that have supposedly got special needs is just exploding. But I mean, yeah, let's not talk about the fact that parents just give their kids an iPad and leave them to their own devices. Yeah, so I think the biggest one is the terrorist attack that happened yesterday. I pretty speechless at the response to it. They seem to, the media and politicians seem to talk about it in the sense of like the problem being gun control, and that they need to restrict the population's access to guns in Australia, which to me seems pretty mental, being as they don't have a huge amount of gun crimes. It is, but it's especially ridiculous when you consider the fact that, I mean, there's still people pretending like the motive of the attackers isn't really known, but his car, or their car, was found with an ISIS flag on the dashboard, and they apparently had been training at some kind of terrorist training camp in, I think, the Philippines or Indonesia. I think the Philippines, and apparently this was known that they had done this. Baffling, but the fact that someone like that is just not immediately having someone suspicious like that is not immediately having their guns taken away from them is just bewildering. But yeah, I mean, it was obviously an Islamic terrorist attack targeting Jews. I mean, it was fucking on Hanukkah, for Christ's sake. I mean, what more evidence do you need of the motivation? I think it's pretty clear, unless you're like, deliberately pretending not to know what's going on here. But yeah, I just think the Australian political elite, they seem to be having the same kind of brain rot as most other governments across the West, like, in Canada and Europe and here. It just seems they want to do everything possible other than recognise what this actually is. They spent more time talking about the bloody far right than Islamist extremism. I mean, for Christ's sake, like what more do you need to see to know which is the biggest threat? I mean, the data already backs it up, but when something like this happens, and they just seem as well. I mean, don't get me wrong, the Syrian bloke who had moved to Australia, and the one who got basically wrestled one of the attackers and got his gun off him, and then ended up getting shot. He's still alive, but yeah, of course his actions were heroic, but I just find it pretty disturbing how the the media seem to just focus purely on the fact he's a Muslim, and to almost like frame this as, oh well, there's no issue with Islam in the West because look, the guy who saved you was a Muslim, as if the terrorist attackers weren't Muslim. It's. I think the debate around Islam in the West is quite. We're not going to get very heated, but I think it lacks. I mean, I think we're getting to a point where a lot of people are getting very tired of nuance, or don't really have the time for it or patience for it. But I think it is important because, I mean, yes, obviously it's not a. I mean, it's a tired cliche. Oh, not all Muslims are bad, and yes, we know that, and it's obviously true. But there is clearly a significant proportion of them in the West that are, and I think what 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 speaks to me most is actually a lot of the condemnation I've seen online has come more from sources in the Middle East, from the Muslim world, than in the West. A lot of the sort of Muslim associations or Islamic organizations in Britain, Australia, and Canada, other countries, many Anglosphere countries, but especially Britain, it's just been sort of obfuscation and deflection and sort of, oh, we condemn all acts of terror. It's an attack on all of us. And, we mustn't forget, the far right, and we understand what this is like because Muslims are so persecuted, X, Y, and Z. Doing as much as they can to make out this wasn't specifically an attack on Jewish people for being Jewish. And yet I've seen so many voices from the UAE, Saudi Arabia, explicitly say this is Islamic extremism in our countries. We have dealt with this. We know what to do. You're not taking this seriously. And they're completely right. And I think this is where I think that some elements of mostly the right go wrong in sort of condemning all of Islam to the, as if they're all the same when they're really not. I think it's not just the religion. I mean, the religion does play a part of it. I mean, amongst, a majority of these terrorist attacks, Islam is the common thread among them all. But there's a reason nowadays you don't see terrorists coming from Saudi Arabia or, Kuwait, for example. Those countries have dealt with this problem. They frankly, they modernized and decided that they would rather get rich than spend their lives terrorizing the West. And I think there's other countries that are yet to have that kind of reformation. And it's not just Islam, it's Islam with a combination of other cultural and sort of tribal factors that frankly are just as important, if not more important, than the commonality or fact of Islam being involved in this. I think countries like Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran to a slight extent, but maybe lesser so because it is otherwise a great civilization if you strip out the Islamist takeover from the revolution. But yeah, I mean, specifically countries like Pakistan and the sort of Central Asia, Indian subcontinent per se, or some of maybe the African countries that are Muslim majority, or the sort of Arab world nations that are still in turmoil. They're this the combination of Islam with their tribal nature and culture is frankly, without a modernizing force to restrain it and contain it, is a bad mix, and a mix that in the West we should be much more aware of, because frankly these people are not like us, and we can integrate and assimilate small amounts of people. You can vet small amounts of people, But with the mass immigration we've seen for the last God knows how many years now, it is simply impossible to adequately vet and, make sure the kind of people you're letting in are people that are going to be of benefit to your society and not become a problem. I've seen it warned so many times from figures in the Middle East who have said that in the future there would be more Islamic terrorism coming out of the West than there would the Islamic world. And we are well into that transition now. And I just don't think that enough politicians or figures in the West have even woken up to this yet. And I think, especially on the left, there's a lot of leaders who either don't even want to recognize this or don't understand it. And they are still in this state of, they've been relying on placating Muslims and their votes to help them win. And they know that if that goes, their power goes too. And so, and that they will lose. Not that it won't happen anyway, but they will lose to parties like Reform in Britain. And so I think, we've got to have a complete change of approach. I mean, this relationship we've had with it for, I don't know how long now, 30, 40 years, of sort of being laissez-faire, hands off, and we can't demand X, Y, or Z from them because we have liberty and freedom. I'm sorry that there's an extremely large proportion of people who have come here who do not view it in that sense. They see it as an opportunity to, I don't know if I want to use the term take over, but use our freedoms and liberties against us in order to push their own agenda. They work within our framework to get what they want. And that is not true of all immigrants from everywhere. There's, I think even some Muslims, I mean, that's not their agenda. And there's plenty of them that do actually speak out against this. But in a sense, they're shunned by other members of the sort of so-called Muslim community in the West. But I think that's partly as a consequence of the kind and places we've been importing people from. I mean, most Muslims in Britain are Pakistanis, but I've noticed a growing trend of Muslims from other parts of the world in this country who are increasingly just as concerned about elements of that community as the rest of us. And even as Muslims, they're finding themselves not having that commonality with them. I mean, for example, I look at Zia Yusuf and Reform. The guy's so far from, the kind of problematic Muslim immigrant that we that would jump to mind when thinking about this problem. The guy's so obviously not a problem. I feel like other than his faith and obviously his skin color, there is really nothing different with him to us. He's part of us and one of us. And I think, especially with how turbulent things are getting now, I think people like him should be embraced and sort of, we don't want to reject them and risk losing them because where else are they going to go? We need to make sure that they know that their place is with us and not with these sort of other people who would seek to capitalize on any grievances that Muslims or issues that Muslims may have in the West. Because if you look at the trend in the demographics, it's not looking good. And I mean, for as long as the left remains in power, this demographic shift is going to continue. And I think, we need to make sure that we're not alienating people who would otherwise be our own allies, because without them, we at this point, we can't win. And I think that's what elements of the right aren't really, some of them aren't understanding, or I'd say on the more fringe right, they're not really understanding. But yeah, I think ultimately, I think the majority of people do understand this and will come to understand this, and sort of this is what I see as being a sensible moderate ground will prevail. When I say sensible moderate ground, I don't mean Lib Dems or Tories. I mean, to be honest, that is kind of what I consider reform to be, a sensible middle moderate ground. But there we are. Let's see if there's what else has happened. Anything noteworthy? Yeah, someone broke into Parliament. See, the security is as tight as ever. Trump's suing the BBC. So apparently for 10 billion, which will probably sink them if he won. But to be honest, I don't think he will win, because I just don't think there's enough strength in his claim, because I think he'd be claiming that there's been material damage to his reputation as a result of it. And I'm not being funny, it's Trump. He says all sorts of things. I don't think as much as, don't get me wrong, the BBC is completely wrong with what they did, but I don't think it did any extra material harm to Trump's reputation, because his reputation was already dodgy. I don't say I'm not an anti-Trumper. He's a mixed bag. Like, I think he's done some good things, and he's says a lot of questionable things, but I just kind of, he is who he is, and I take him as he is. I don't really, I see his impact on the world as the net good. I just don't necessarily think everything he is or does is good, but people are complicated, so it's whatever. I see the hit in the tips is not ruling out an election deal with Labour to keep Farage out. I love how they basically spent the time saying that Labour have gone to the right and that Labour are placating fascism and all the rest of it. Ridiculous claims. But if that were true, then why the hell would you be willing to go into a deal with them just to keep reform out? Baffles me. But everything this guy does baffles me. Starmer has, unemployment's going through the roof, unsurprisingly. I mean, everything this government's doing is just wrecking the economy and the confidence of businesses to be able to employ people. Why on earth we still have any immigration to this country at a time where unemployment is rising and people already in jobs can't switch jobs, I just find completely baffling. I just don't understand it. It bewilders me. We don't have a labour shortage, but that's all we seem to hear from the left, is that we have labour shortages. Well, I'm sorry, we don't. If unemployment's at 5%, then there are plenty of people looking for work. But yeah, I think it's another week of bad news, unfortunately. But other than reform going up a little bit in the polls, but I think we'll keep an eye on that, and I'll do another review next week. Hopefully something more will happen. It's been a bit of a quiet week. But yeah, I think this channel is going to be just really about me just sort of airing my thoughts on what's happened in the week, and just sort of me ranting, really. I think of myself as kind of like a sort of right of centre right. I wouldn't say I'm like really, really right wing, but I'd say I'm to the right of the centre right. But I think that's, a fairly moderate position. I'm flexible on a lot of economic stuff. I think generally if it works, just do it. If it brings us prosperity and the trade-offs are acceptable to the majority of people, just do it. But I think economic policy, you can kind of chop and change that, experimenting, and you can very easily go back to something that works if something you do doesn't work. But when it comes to social policy and immigration, demographics, those things are so much more difficult to reverse. And I think you have to tread much more carefully on that front. So I wouldn't necessarily consider myself a conservative, because I don't know if I want to conserve what we have now, because it's not good. Maybe I consider myself, I don't know, a bit of a restorationist, probably an Anglo-futurist, I guess. I don't know. I'm someone who thinks there were the past isn't necessarily a better place, but where we are now, I don't want to conserve that either. I'm definitely not a progressive because I don't think how we've been changing is progress. I have various views. I think, generally the British Empire was a force for good on the world. And I think it was a better place when we were top dog. But yeah, and I think a lot of my worldview kind of stems from that. I guess that's a controversial thing to say. I don't really think it is. I think if you just objectively, if you look at the world when we were in charge versus how it is now, there's a lot more turmoil. There's a lot of bad in the world, and obviously there was then. But I think ultimately the world needs a policeman, and if America's going to back out, then we're going to end up in a multipolar world. And arguably, we are in a multipolar world now, where you basically have multiple big powers competing for dominance in different regions. And I don't think that's a good thing. It's inevitable. You can't stop it because that is just fundamentally human nature and what happens when you have power vacuums. But this is where we are. And, I'd much rather it was just us in charge. Our systems are still in place in many countries, and, the way we used to be, it worked. And I think we've lost our way here, so we don't really have the authority now to wade back into anywhere and say, we've had enough of everything that's coming out of your country. You can't govern yourselves. We're coming back, and there's no way we can do that at the moment because, everyone's just going to point at us and say, "Bloody hell, get your own house in order." So, yeah, I'll leave it there for this week, and yeah, thanks for watching.